I hadn't cried in 3 days. Not once, not when I stood in the rain calling her name until my throat gave out, not when I taped the last flyer to the mailbox wall and my hand was shaking too hard to smooth the tape down. But when I opened my door on a Tuesday afternoon and a stranger was standing there holding my cat like something breakable, something in my chest just came apart all at once. And I had to grab the doorframe to keep my knees from giving out. "I think this is yours," he said. Pepper let out that indignant little chirp she makes when she's being held against her will, the one that means she has strong opinions about her current circumstances. And I started crying right there in the hallway, in front of a man I had never once spoken to in the 6 months I'd lived in this building. "My name is Josie. I'm 27, I illustrate children's books for a living, which sounds charming until you realize it means I spend 10 hours a day alone with a cat and a deadline. And 3 days before this stranger knocked on my door, that cat had slipped out during a thunderstorm while I was hauling groceries up from my car, and I hadn't seen her since. I want to tell you Pepper is just a cat, she isn't, not to me. She showed up on my fire escape the week my last relationship ended, skinny and soaked and furious at the whole world, and I let her in because I recognized the feeling. 3 years later, she was the only living thing that greeted me when I came home, the only one who noticed if I hadn't eaten. And when she vanished into that storm, I did not handle it like a well-adjusted adult. I put up 40 flyers. I walked the block at 2 a.m. with a can of tuna and a flashlight. I had, that very morning, allowed myself to consider the possibility that she was gone for good, and I had not yet figured out how to survive that thought. So when the knock came, I wasn't ready for good news. I'd stopped expecting it. "You're the one with the flyers," the man in my doorway said when I didn't say anything back. "Building super gave me your unit number." "I'm sorry, I should have come sooner. I just wasn't sure it was actually your cat until I saw the picture again this morning." He was maybe 30, tall in that unhurried way some men are. Like he'd never once had to duck through a doorway in his life, sawdust on the shoulders of his jacket and a scar through one eyebrow that made him look like he'd survived something. He held Pepper like he'd done it before, one hand under her chest, and she was purring against him, the traitor, purring like she hadn't put me through the worst 3 days of my year. Where, I finally managed, was she? Storage level, sub-basement. "I've got a workshop down there, I do woodwork, furniture mostly," and she'd wedged herself behind the water heater the night of the storm. I heard her before I ever saw her. Took me a full day just to coax her out. He shifted her gently into my arms, and the second her weight settled against me, the second I felt her heartbeat going too fast under all that fur, I stopped being able to speak in full sentences. "Thank you," I said, which felt criminally insufficient. "Thank you, I don't know how to. You don't have to do anything." He was already stepping back, hands in his pockets like he was worried he'd overstayed something. "I'm Eli, by the way. Third floor, I've seen your flyers all over the block, they're very thorough." Thorough was a kind word for what those flyers actually were, which was unhinged. I'd used 4 different fonts. There was a reward listed that my bank account absolutely could not support. "I'm Josie," I said, "second floor." Obviously, he smiled at that, an actual smile, not a polite one, and something about it made me forget for a second that I was standing in my doorway with tear tracks down my face, holding a cat. Talking to a man I'd apparently lived 30 feet above for half a year without ever noticing. That should have been the end of it. A kind neighbor, a returned cat, a story I'd tell at dinner parties for years. But 2 nights later, Pepper went missing again. Not really missing, I found the note taped to my door before I even started to panic. "Your cat is an escape artist. She's in 3C, no rush, but she does seem to prefer it down here. E." I went up in my slippers, feeling ridiculous, and found Pepper curled on a workbench in a basement apartment that smelled like cedar and linseed oil. Surrounded by half-finished chairs and the bones of what looked like it was going to be a boat, an actual small sailboat, ribs of pale wood curving up out of a tarp on the floor. "She likes the sawdust," Eli said, not looking up from the joint he was sanding. "Cats like warm, enclosed things." "I think your radiator's louder than mine. Are you telling me my cat is judging my HVAC? I'm telling you she has excellent taste in flooring." I laughed, really laughed. The kind I hadn't done in the 3 days she'd been gone, and he looked up at that, surprised, like the sound had caught him off guard. I stayed longer than I meant to. I asked about the boat. He told me his grandfather had built one just like it on a lake in Michigan, and that he was rebuilding it from a memory more than a set of plans. Which he admitted was probably a bad way to build a boat. That became the shape of the next month. Pepper would wander down to 3C the way some people's kids wander to the neighbor with the good snacks, and I would follow her. And Eli and I would end up talking for an hour longer than either of us intended, always about something small, wood grain, a book on his shelf. Why I'd chosen watercolor over digital for my last project. He never asked the big questions, the ones people ask when they're trying to figure out if you're worth their time. He asked what kind of tea I liked. He noticed I always looked at door frames before I walked through them, a habit from an apartment I'd once lived in with low ceilings, and he never made me explain it. I should tell you I was not in a place to want any of this. 8 months before Pepper went missing, I'd ended a 4-year relationship that had quietly turned into something I didn't recognize. Not cruel exactly, just diminishing. The kind of thing where you wake up one day and realize you've gotten smaller to fit inside it. I'd moved into this building specifically because it was far from everything we'd shared, and I had promised myself, out loud to my best friend Priya, over a bottle of wine on my first night here, that I was taking a full year off from anything resembling romantic hope. You're allowed to just like someone, Priya told me when I finally admitted, weeks into this, that I'd started looking forward to Tuesdays because that was trash day in Eli, and I always ended up hauling bins out at the same time. Liking someone isn't the same as blowing up your plan. It's exactly the same as blowing up my plan. Josie, he fixed your cabinet door for free on a Sunday. I hadn't asked him to. I'd mentioned once in passing that it stuck, and the following week there was a note under my door. Didn't want to just barge in. Are you around Sunday? And he'd spent 40 minutes on his knees in my kitchen with a chisel and a level, refusing the $20 I tried to hand him afterward, refusing dinner too. Though I could tell by the way he lingered at my door after that he'd wanted to say yes to something. It was around then that things started to feel less like coincidence and more like choice. Pepper still wandered down to his place, but I started going even when she didn't, knocking with an actual reason, a book to return, a question about the boat. Until the reasons got thinner and thinner, and neither of us bothered pretending we needed one. Then, for about a week, I stopped going down at all. It started with something small and stupid. I'd come back from a supply run and seen him in the courtyard with a woman I didn't recognize, laughing at something. Her hand resting on his arm in a way that made my stomach drop before I'd even decided whether I had the right to feel that. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I had no claim on him, that we'd never so much as talked about what this was, that a man was allowed to have women in his life who weren't me. But some old, well-worn part of me, the part that had spent 4 years learning to shrink around someone else's attention drifting elsewhere, took the sight of them and ran with it. And I did what I always did when I got scared. I got quiet. I stopped answering his notes with more than a word. I let Pepper wander down alone and didn't follow. He noticed. Of course he noticed. On the 5th day, there was a knock, and when I opened the door, he didn't come in, just stood there with his hands jammed in his pockets, looking like he'd rehearsed something and forgotten half of it. Did I do something? He asked. No preamble, no small talk, which almost undid me more than anything else could have. I saw you, I said, and immediately hated how small it sounded, in the courtyard with someone. Something crossed his face, not defensiveness, more like a kind of tired sadness. That was my sister, he said, Rachel. She flew in because it's been a year since our mom died, and she wanted to see the boat, since mom's the one who used to take us out on the real one. He said it plainly, without asking for pity. But I heard the weight underneath it anyway. I should have introduced you. I didn't realize what it would have looked like from your window. I felt about 2 inches tall. Eli, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. You don't have to apologize for being scared of something, he said, quieter now. I just wish you'd have asked me instead of disappearing on me for 5 days. I kept thinking I'd blown it. I didn't know how. I told him then more than I'd told anyone since the breakup, about the 4 years of quietly disappearing to make room for someone else's moods. About how I'd trained myself to read a held hand or a raised eyebrow as the beginning of the end, and how none of that was fair to bring to his doorstep. But I hadn't figured out yet how to leave it behind. He listened the whole way through without trying to fix it, which was, I was starting to learn, exactly his way of fixing things. I'm not going anywhere, he said finally. But I'd rather you slam the door in my face than go quiet on me. I can work with slamming. I can't work with quiet. I laughed despite myself, wet-eyed and a little wrecked, and Pepper picked that exact moment to come barreling down the hallway and insert herself between our ankles. And whatever tension was left in the air broke apart into something softer. The twist came on a Thursday, almost exactly a month after that first knock, and it came from him, not from me, in the middle of a sentence about nothing. We were on his floor, backs against the hull of the half-finished boat, splitting a bottle of wine out of jam jars because he didn't own real wineglasses, and I asked him, lightly, the way you ask something you don't expect to actually land anywhere, how long it had taken him to find her that first night behind the water heater. He went quiet in a way that made me put my jar down. I found her the same night she got out, he said. That first night, I heard her almost immediately. I did the math without meaning to. That's Eli, that's 2 days before you knocked. I know. Why didn't you? I stopped because I could see, even in the low light, that this was costing him something to say. Because I'd seen you before, he said. Before the cat, before any of this. 6 weeks before, maybe in the stairwell, late, you were on the phone, and you were crying, trying not to make noise about it. And I didn't know you, so I didn't say anything. I just walked past like I hadn't seen, because what do you say to a stranger crying in a stairwell? And I thought about it for weeks. I thought if I ever got a real reason to talk to you, I wouldn't walk past again. He turned the jar in his hands, not looking at me. So when I found your cat, I had this reason sitting right there in my basement, and I panicked, and I told myself I needed a day to make sure she wasn't hurt, and then a day turned into 2. Because the second I gave her back, I didn't have a reason left to knock on your door again. It wasn't about the cat, I just didn't know how else to start. I didn't know whether to be furious or undone. I think for a moment I was both. You let me think she was gone for 2 extra days. I know, I'm not proud of it, I almost told you a dozen times. He finally looked at me. I've never been good at the part where you just walk up to someone and say the thing. I'm good at fixing cabinets. I'm not good at this. I thought about that stairwell, that phone call. I remembered it actually once he said it out loud. Remembered feeling like the whole building could hear how badly my life was falling apart that week. Remembered nobody stopping, and some small, stubborn part of me had been grateful nobody had. Because I didn't want to be seen like that. And now here was the reason. Someone had seen exactly that, and it hadn't made him walk away. It had made him wait badly, clumsily, for a reason to come back. That's either the most romantic thing anyone's done for me, I said, or the most elaborate scheme involving a cat I've ever heard of. Statistically, it might be both, I laughed. But it wasn't the easy laugh from before. It had something rower underneath it, because I understood suddenly that this wasn't a cute story about a lost cat. It was a story about 2 people who had both been quietly waiting for permission to want something, and a gray tabby with an escape habit had run out of patience for both of us. The storm came 4 nights later, the anniversary almost of the one that had taken Pepper in the first place, and it knocked the power out across the whole block. I was fumbling for candles when there was a knock at my door. Eli, holding a flashlight and absurdly a thermos of coffee, because his stove ran on gas and mine didn't. Figured you'd want caffeine more than company, he said, but I brought both in case. We ended up on the floor of my living room, backs against the couch, candles between us. Pepper stretched across both our laps like she'd claimed us as a joint property. The rain hit the windows the way it had the night she disappeared, and for a while neither of us said anything, just listened to it. And I found myself watching the side of his face in the candlelight and thinking about stairwells, about the 6 weeks he'd carried around a memory of me crying and said nothing. About how much courage it must have taken to finally, badly, imperfectly try. I keep thinking, I said, about how much I almost didn't answer that door. I almost let it go to voicemail. I thought it was a delivery. I almost didn't knock, he said. I stood outside your door for 10 minutes, with my cat, with your cat, very confused cat. Kept trying to leave. I laughed and he reached over, slow, careful, the way you'd reach for something you weren't sure was allowed yet, and brushed a strand of hair back from my face. And the laugh caught in my throat and turned into something else. Outside, the storm kept going. Inside, everything went very quiet and very warm, and when he leaned in, I met him halfway, and it was soft at first, hesitant, both of us checking, and then it wasn't hesitant at all. The candles burned low. The rain didn't let up until morning, and neither did we, not really, not in any way that needs more explaining than that. 6 months later, the boat sat finished in the courtyard, and half of Eli's tools had migrated to my apartment because, as he put it, my radiator really was louder. And Pepper had apparently decided that the space between our 2 front doors belonged to her now. Sleeping in the hallway most afternoons like she was guarding the border of a kingdom she'd built entirely by accident. You know, Priya said, visiting for the first time since the storm, watching Eli fix a wobbly chair leg at my kitchen table without being asked. Your cat has better instincts than either of us. She ran into a basement during a thunderstorm. That's not instinct, that's chaos. Chaos that got you here. Priya raised her mug at Eli, who raised his back easy like he'd always belonged in that kitchen. I'll take it. I think about it sometimes, how close the whole thing came to not happening if I'd taken the stairs a different night. If he'd walked past that stairwell without ever looking back at what he saw. If Pepper had picked a different building, a different basement, a different stranger. But she didn't, and he didn't. and somewhere in the space between a stairwell he couldn't forget and a storm that gave him an excuse to stop waiting. I got a whole life I didn't know I was looking for, wrapped up, absurdly in the shape of a cat who still, to this day, prefers his side of the bed to mine. If you're still here, thank you, genuinely, for sitting with this one all the way to the end. If a story like this is the kind of thing that gets you, I'd love it if you stuck around and followed along for more, because there are a lot more of these where this came from. And I have to ask because I always want to know, has anything like this ever happened to you? Has some small, ridiculous thing ever ended up being the reason your whole life changed? Or maybe you've watched it happen to someone close to you, a friend, a sister, someone who swore they weren't looking and found something anyway. Tell me in the comments. I read every single one.